The ceremony in Washington had gone well. Neil Armstrong had shaken hands, smiled for photographs, and spoken with the assembled diplomats in the way that astronauts were asked to do, as representatives of a country that had staked its prestige on reaching space first and in peace. The document they had gathered to witness was called the Outer Space Treaty. 67 nations had signed it or would sign it. It promised that the moon and the planets would belong to all of humanity and to none of it. That space would never be weaponized, that whoever reached it first would do so on behalf of the species. The Soviet Union had signed it too. In Moscow, simultaneously, an ambassador putting his name to the same document that the American Secretary of State was signing in Washington. Two nations that had been racing each other for 9 years had agreed, on paper, that whatever they were competing over, it would not be space. By 6:45 in the evening, the astronauts and the diplomats had finished talking and were beginning to say their goodbyes. Neil Armstrong and the others returned to the Georgetown Inn. There were message slips at the hotel desk. Each of them was asked to phone the manned spacecraft center in Houston. During those calls, they learned that at 6:31 that evening, 14 minutes before they left the ceremony, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee had died in a fire on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy, Florida. Neil Armstrong and his fellow astronauts, Gordon Cooper, Dick Gordon, Jim Lovell, Scott Carpenter, spent the rest of that night together in the hotel. They drank scotch. They talked about what had happened. They were test pilots, trained in the culture of the fighter squadron, where you did not display what a thing cost you. What they did was what men of their generation did with the unbearable. They stayed in the room with it until the morning came. That was January 27th, 1967, the date that would carry, from that evening forward, 3 things at once. The treaty, signed at noon, the fire at 6:31, and the next morning, January 28th, the private one. Karen Ann Armstrong had died on January 28th, 1962. She had been 2 years old. Her father had never spoken of her in public. The date lived in him, quietly and permanently. And now, the 27th, the day before, would carry its own weight for the rest of his life. This is the story of that Friday in January, the fire that almost ended the Apollo program, the particular cruelty of a date, and the way that a man who had already learned to carry one impossible thing in January was asked on the same night to begin carrying 3 more. It was 1967, and the space race was running on ambition and schedule pressure and, as it was turning out, inadequate oversight. The Gemini program had ended the previous November with 12 missions. Apollo was supposed to go to the moon. President Kennedy had set the end of the decade as the deadline, and the decade was running out. The pressure had a specific shape that year. 3 years remained, 2 full years of work and testing and launch windows. NASA had its successes behind it and a program ahead of it that had to perform, or the decade would pass without the moon. The Soviet Union was moving at its own pace, its own secrets, its own casualties were 3 months away. At Cape Kennedy, the problems with the Apollo Block 1 command module had been building for months. Gus Grissom, Mercury veteran, Gemini 3 commander, the most experienced astronaut in the program, had been so frustrated with the spacecraft's performance that he had hung a lemon on the flight simulator. Hundreds of unresolved engineering issues, bad wiring, a defective pump, leaking thrusters. The hatch opened inward, efficient in orbital flight, impossible to open quickly on the ground. The atmosphere inside the capsule was 100% pure oxygen. The night before the test, backup commander Wally Schirra had run the same simulation and come out shaking his head. He found Grissom in a corridor. He said, "If you have the slightest glitch, get out of there." Gus Grissom was 40 years old. He had been the second American in space, the man who had nearly drowned when his Mercury capsule hatch blew prematurely after splashdown, a controversy that followed him for years. He had come back to command Gemini 3 and answered every doubter. His gift was a pilot's directness. He saw what was true and said so. Ed White was 36. The first American to walk in space, the man who had floated 23 minutes above the Earth on Gemini 4 and said, when they called him back inside, that it was the saddest moment of his life. He lived in El Lago, Texas, on the land plot adjacent to Neil Armstrong's. They had bought their properties at the same time in the early 1960s when NASA first moved to Houston. Their children had grown up in the same yards. Roger Chaffee was 31. He had spent 5 years supporting the program. He had never been to space. His first flight was 3 weeks away. The morning of January 27th began with small problems that accumulated. Grissom entered the capsule and detected a strange smell in the oxygen supply. They stopped the test. Communications between the spacecraft and the blockhouse began breaking down. The men were still strapped in, still suited, still on pure oxygen, still waiting when the afternoon became the evening. At 6:31, a voice came over the intercom. It said, "Fire." What happened in the next 5 minutes and 30 seconds has been reconstructed from recordings and testimony. Deke Slayton, watching a closed-circuit monitor in the blockhouse, saw white flames through the capsule's window. The ground crew ran for the spacecraft. The hatch required at least 90 seconds to open under ideal conditions. The pressure and heat inside had already exceeded any standard for survival. Before the first technician reached the capsule, the command module ruptured. Smoke poured out. 27 technicians were treated that night for smoke inhalation. When the hatch was finally opened at 6:37, it was over. 3 men who had been alive and frustrated and waiting had been dead for minutes. In Washington, at that exact moment, Neil Armstrong was still in the company of diplomats, talking about peace in space. The news reached the Georgetown Inn by message slips left at the front desk. Gus was gone. Ed was gone. Roger was gone. Ed White had been Armstrong's neighbor. Pat White and Janet Armstrong were friends. That evening, in El Lago, Ed White's son rode his bicycle home from playing football. Janet Armstrong was standing in the White family's driveway. Something in how she stood told the boy what he did not yet know, and he was sent to a neighbor's house before anyone said the words to him. Neil Armstrong sat in a hotel room in Washington and talked and drank and did not go to bed. There was nothing to be done that night except be there with the others who understood what it meant. He was not a man who announced grief, and he was not a man who had no access to it. He had a daughter in a cemetery in Ohio and a neighbor who was now gone, and the treaty he had witnessed that afternoon sat in a display case at the State Department, promising peace in a domain where 3 men had just burned to death. The investigation lasted months. The review board identified the probable ignition source as a frayed wire bundle beneath Grissom's seat, sparking in a pure oxygen atmosphere at 16 pounds per square inch. The inward opening hatch was redesigned to open outward in 7 seconds. The oxygen atmosphere on the ground was changed to a mix of oxygen and nitrogen. 200 engineering changes were made to the command module before any astronaut flew in it again. The program was grounded for 21 months. Inside the astronaut office during those months, the men who were assigned to subsequent flights continued their training. They studied the investigation reports. They watched the spacecraft being rebuilt, wire by wire. The capsule that had killed 3 men became, through everything that was learned and corrected and rebuilt, the capsule safe enough to reach the moon. Vladimir Komarov died 3 months after the fire. his Soyuz 1 spacecraft crashed on re-entry on April 24, 1967. He had known the spacecraft was not ready. He flew it anyway, because if he refused, his backup, Yuri Gagarin, would have been sent in his place. He chose to go. Both programs had their dead now. The race was not humane. It had never pretended to be. By the spring of 1967, 4 men had died in 4 months, on both sides, in both languages. The programs went on. 2.5 years after the fire, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stood on the surface of the moon, preparing to leave. Before they lifted off, they placed several items in the dust of the Sea of Tranquility, things they had carried from Earth that would not return with them. Among them was a mission patch, not Apollo 11's patch. The patch of the Apollo 1 crew, Grissom, White, Chaffee, the mission that had been given its name after its crew died, the mission that never flew. They left it on the moon. There are things a man carries that he does not talk about. By January of 1967, Neil Armstrong had already learned this better than most people are asked to. Karen's death had started it in 1962. The fire had added to it in 1967. He was 36 years old that winter, and January had become his month of wait. The 27th with the fire and the treaty and the hotel room in Washington. The 28th with the headstone in Wapakoneta. Both things went with him to the moon. He left a mission patch in the dust. He came home to El Lago, and the house next door to his, for the rest of the years he lived there, belonged to someone else. The Outer Space Treaty has held for nearly 60 years. Space has remained free of nuclear weapons. The promise made in Washington on the morning of January 27, 1967, has outlasted the Cold War, the space race, and most of the men who signed it. The men who put their names to it in the afternoon, and the men who died that evening, are part of the same sentence in the history of that year. And the man who was in the room for both, who shook hands at noon and learned what had happened at 7 in the evening, carried them both for the rest of his life. If you remember where you were when you heard about the Apollo 1 fire, tell us in the comments and subscribe. There are more quiet legends still waiting to be told.